Picture the harbour, still and moonlit, the creak of wooden docks, the hush of waves brushing against hulls, and the faint rustle of feathers tied onto colonial hats. No, not for a masquerade, but for rebellion in the most boring, tea-soaked way possible. The Boston Tea Party wasn't loud, it wasn't fast, and it wasn't really a party. It was slow, cold, and surprisingly quiet. Tonight we'll drift through the midnight hours of December 16th, 1753, not with drama, but with drowsy details of crates, ships, and the long wait before history brewed up revolution. If you like your bedtime stories with a splash of rebellion and a spoonful of sleep, go ahead and subscribe, tap the like button, and ring the bell icon. More sleepy revolutions and boring bedtime battles await. Let's steep in the slow side of history, one crate of tea at a time. You begin at a table, not a battlefield. The table is oak, scarred and practical, in a kitchen warmed by a brick hearth. It is late afternoon, and light slips through old glass panes, bending into a softened haze that makes the dust look like weather caught mid-air. A small kettle sits on a trivet near the coals, not yet boiling, but promising a steady measure of comfort. This is not a moment of crisis. It is a moment of routine. In 1773, tea is not a luxury at this table. It is the anchor for the end of day, a beverage for visitors, a mild stimulant for work that still stretches ahead into evening. You do not drink it as a symbol. You drink it because water is iffy, milk is scarce, and beer and cider have their place, but not always. And tea offers a clean, predictable ritual that pairs with bread, butter, and whatever jam remains from the fall. The leaves are folded and papery, brittle until they meet hot water. The kettle begins to sing. You measure carefully because tea is cheap enough to drink, but dear enough to waste. The cups are mismatched and chipped at the rims where they've kissed too many hours. For you and your neighbours, tea has crept into daily life over the last half-century, the way a habit becomes a habit. Quietly, households keep small wooden boxes with sliding lids to hold leaves, sometimes locked because small things invite small thefts. The most common types are familiar words: bohea for the darker blends, souchong, kongu, and the occasional pale, grassy hyson for those who can afford it. You know how to warm the pot before adding water, not because you read it in a book, but because people around you do it, and enough repetition makes a rule. You know the proper color of the brew and what to do if it steeps too long and goes bitter. Add more water, drink quickly, or pretend you meant that strength. Starch-collared men and apron-wrapped women perform the same movements. Tea erases some differences. It also creates new ones because those who can acquire sugar, porcelain, and silver tongs announce their means by the objects that attend the leaves. But in a port town like Boston, ships bring more than ideas. They bring the goods themselves, the last stop in a chain that stretches outward to oceans you will never see. To understand why tea matters to you, you have to imagine the long, slow-muscled system that brings it from distant hills to this soft, amber liquid in your cup. The journey starts with pickers whose names you will never learn, and passes through broker hands in cities whose names you might mispronounce. Crates are packed with leaves and lined to resist damp, the wooden slats stamped and chalked with marks so obvious a dock worker can read them at a glance without reading at all. Ships carry them to London, where an immense and intricate company manages auctions and contracts under a legal structure difficult to love and necessary to navigate. The company's warehouses absorb tea like granaries swallow grain. Then, once its watchers and clerks have counted, recorded and taxed, they release the chests to licensed merchants who send them across the Atlantic again, down another chain of clerks and porters and pursers and mates toward towns like yours that stand with their faces to the sea and their backs to the forests. Along that chain, The price of tea changes at every hand. You may not write down the numbers, but you feel their pull. A cheap cup today can become dear tomorrow if supply hesitates, or a ship runs aground on a shoal you will never walk. The price is also a conversation about law. Taxes have clung to tea like burrs since Parliament needed revenue after wars paid on credit and territory acquired that must be governed. But many people you know prefer not to pay for something they cannot feel in their hand. And so a second chain shadows the first. Tea that slips across beaches at night, tea that rides in hollowed barrels beneath other goods, tea that travels with stories sharp enough to cut questions short. Dutch tea, they call it. And it is not a rumor, and it is not a secret, but it is not a topic for polite tables. You have tasted both, and there is no difference in flavor that justifies the difference in cost. If one cup is 2 pence less than another and tastes the same, the choice is not a question of patriotism to anyone who must account for the price of flour every week. In town, this means that the grand and the ordinary access the same leaves, though not with the same tools. Wealthier houses cabinet their tea in japanned boxes painted with scenes from worlds that function as fantasy maps for people who will never cross oceans. You might have a kettle that must be set at the edge of coals and coaxed, while someone on Beacon Hill keeps a faster one and taller coals. But the rhythm is alike. While you pour, children count the drips, and the older ones ask for more sugar than you can spare. Sugar arrives in hard cones wrapped in blue paper that you save to whiten windows or line trunks. It must be nipped with a little iron tool into manageable lumps. If a guest arrives, you show that you keep tea even when money is tight, and the guest pretends not to notice how carefully you measure. Hospitality is a performance of plenty. Tea makes it possible to stage that performance on ordinary days. Outside the house, tea moves in bundles, in casks, in the careful order of the wharf. You walk there sometimes in the grey hours of morning, when wind from the harbour makes tar smell like a promise, and rope walks stretch their damp, twisting fibres across long, narrow sheds. The wharf is an alphabet of labour, barrels rolled, lines coiled, crates stacked. Men with hooks manoeuvre cargo with a practised swing, shoulders braced, hips low. The water slaps with hollow patience against pilings worn to their grain. Scales balance more than weight. They balance the trust of buyers and sellers who settle not only accounts, but reputations. Clerks mark numbers in dull ink, neat as fence pickets, while captains sign papers that tether their cargo to law with knots as complex as any rope splice. Tea is not treated like treasure, only like cargo, valuable, yes, but not precious. That is the point. Tea survives because it is ordinary most of the time. If it can be rolled, carried, stacked, taxed, poured, and drunk without anyone making a speech, it can become part of the day the way bread and salt and soap are part of the day. And yet, as you move through 1773, you can feel something changing in this ordinariness. Word travels faster than ships because word is lighter and has fewer customs to clear. The talk is about new allowances given to the company that holds so much tea in London that their ledgers groan. They have permission to sell directly, the story goes, which means that merchants who used to link hands in the chain will be passed by, and taxes will be simpler to collect. If something is cheaper, you would think there would be less to argue about. But the argument is not entirely about the price of tea. It is about who decides where money goes once the cup is empty. It is about whether a colony is a place or a pocket. At your table, this matters in small practical ways. If certain merchants gain the right to receive company tea, then other merchants you know, the ones who carried Dutch leaves and risked coastal weather in winter to supply your cup at a reasonable price, will lose business. And if taxes are collected on company tea, even though its price drops, then a government across the ocean will receive money from a cup on your table without asking you to vote on the shape of the handle. None of this stops you from drinking tea today. You heat the water, and the kettle rattles like an old friend with a new complaint. You pour, and the steam lifts in an unremarkable ribbon. You think about the balance in your household cash box, about the rum you have been saving for winter nights, about the cost of meat and the price you might get for a cord of wood once the month rolls closer to January. You think about coal versus pine, about how the kettle warms faster when you stack the sticks like a tight triangle and open the little iron door to let the coals breathe. You think about the new boy in the house who is bad at tying off bundles and good at smiling, and how long it will take to teach him to sweep the steps properly without leaving a stripe of grit down the middle like a watermark. You think about the ship in the harbour the neighbour mentioned, and whether you will walk to the waterfront to look at it at dusk, counting the lines and the creak of its timbers as if a ship is a huge clock measuring out a longer time than yours. If you go, you join others who have drifted down to see what has come in. A ship with tea is not rare, but the talk around it is taut. Some men lean on pilings and talk about the papers that must be filed, the 20 days a ship can sit before duty is demanded, the way a collector's office can slow or speed the machinery of commerce by opening a drawer or closing a door. You hear about consignees and commissions and guarantees. The words are dry and complicated, a vocabulary of friction. They are the boring part, the part most people skip when they tell a story later. But here, in the blue hour between day and night, these words feel like the hinges on which the future swings. No one speaks of battles. They speak of warehouse keys, of where cargo will sleep, of who has the authority to move paper from one hand to another. You realize that the difference between shipment and seizure, between a ship that leaves with cargo still in its hull and a ship that becomes a floating problem, is measured in signatures and in the timing of small decisions. Who will be home when the constable knocks? Who will agree to resign a commission? Who will refuse a delivery and make it someone else's problem to store? Tea in this moment is still just tea, but it is also a test. At home again, you find your cup cold. You warm it with a splash from the kettle and drink without thinking. The talk from the wharf echoes with the sound of ropes settling under strain. You know that nights are long in December, and that work will press against the hours no matter what anyone at a meeting says. The calm in your kitchen is not false. It is earned by repetition, but worry nags at the edges of your chores. If ships are held, wages can be interrupted. If cargo is held too long, tempers fray, and when tempers fray, damage happens, the sort of thoughtless damage that makes people poor. You do not want that. You want the wharf to hum, the ledgers to balance, the kettle to sing. You want to know what rule you are living under and what price to pay for a pound of tea next week. Stability is not an idea for you. Stability is a pile of wood, properly stacked, and a bin of flour that will last until spring. Before bed, you fold a cloth over the remaining bread and scrape the table with a dull knife to collect crumbs for tomorrow's stuffing. The children's hands are sticky with sugar because treats bend rules. You count your candles and decide which ones can be burned to the nub and which should be saved for nights when mending runs past midnight. You bank the hearth to keep a small heat alive until morning. If you pray not for glory but for a quiet harbour, a steady income, and no surprises. The world, of course, prefers surprises. The chain that brings tea to your cup has been pulled tight by decisions taken far away. It will snap somewhere. You feel that. You do not know where, and you certainly do not think of yourself as someone who will move the fault lines of an empire. You simply lock the door, check it twice, and notice that the kettle, left close to the embers, begins to sigh again as if it expects to be asked for more. What you will remember later, if you are asked to remember, is how ordinary this evening felt. You will remember the way the tea tasted stronger because you steeped it too long while daydreaming. You will remember that when your neighbour knocked, he stood shifting from foot to foot and asked to borrow your small saw, and you wondered whether he meant to fix his stoop board at last. You will remember that the harbour smelled metallic under the cold, and that your breath hung before you like a cloud you could not quite walk through. You will remember thinking, as you slid the latch at last and went to your bed, that tomorrow would be the same kind of day. and you were grateful. The rules of life were clear. Keep accounts, watch prices, warm the pot before pouring, be friendly to your neighbors.
Fix what breaks.
And when news comes, listen, but then get on with the work that feeds the house. It is a sensible plan. It usually works, but plans rely on the cooperation of many others, and too many of those others are invisible to you. Clerks in rooms you will never see argue about which seal to use and how many copies to make, and whether an order is sufficient to release a ship. Men who never have to rinse a kettle decide whether you will pay a tax in one form or another. Merchants decide whether to sign their names to jobs that will make them money and make them enemies. Those currents run under your feet like hidden water, shaping the ground you walk without asking your feet for permission. It is an uncomfortable thought, and you push it away because you have to sleep. Still, it returns as you close your eyes, like the way you can hear the kettle cooling even after you have left the kitchen. It is not a loud noise, but it holds the room. In the morning, you will do what you always do. You will feed the fire, warm a little water, and check the wind as if the wind deserves its own place in your ledger. You will sweep the steps and remind the new boy to pull the broom toward him, not push it, so the bristles bite the stone and do the work. You will feel, under everything, the memory of last night's talk at the wharf. If a ship cannot unload, it cannot depart. If it cannot depart, the clock of fees and duties keeps ticking.
Someone will have to decide something.
You do not know who. You plan your day anyway, and hope their plans align with yours. The kettle whispers, predictable and kind, and the cup warms your hands through the chill. It is possible to believe that nothing dramatic will happen if you focus on the useful facts of household life, and yet, as you fold linen and stack kindling, you pause for a moment and ask yourself a question you cannot quite shape into words. When an ordinary object like a cup of tea becomes the center of disputes fought in ledgers and on docks and in meeting rooms, what happens to the ordinary people whose hands hold the cups? Do they keep drinking as usual? Or does the liquid begin to taste different, even before anything visible has changed? You wake to arithmetic, though you would not call it that. You move numbers around the way a baker moves flour in a bowl, small adjustments that change the texture of the dough even before you feel it take shape. The day begins with fuel, food, and time, each measured against cost, and this, too, is how towns like yours handle politics. The questions now are not only about tea as a leaf, but tea as a ledger entry. You have heard the phrases often enough that you can recite them even while you tie your apron. Drawback, duty, consignment, commission. The Tea Act, the one everyone keeps naming, is not a trumpet blast. It is a rearrangement of fees and permissions. To you, it means the East India Company can ship tea directly to America and designate trusted men here to receive it, and that the price at the counter ought to fall because certain costs and taxes along the usual route are wiped away like chalk on a tavern slate. The duty in the colonies remains, however, a small mark that is easy enough to ignore in other times and a flashpoint in these. You feel the shape of that duty as you would a splinter under the skin. It is small, but it nags, and the more you touch it, the more it resists. You can tell yourself the cup is cheaper overall, and still pause at the fact that the duty is collected here. Visible in the way the tea is handled, a fingerprint of authority left on a crate that otherwise would pass as any other. Your neighbors, especially those who sail small craft along the coast by night and know the inlets better than they know their cousins, do their own arithmetic. If legal tea, even cheaper than before, comes with the stain of a duty paid into a chest guarded by men who answer to an office in London, then buying it is no longer a simple act of thrift. It is a kind of speech. Not everyone wants to speak. Many would rather drink and get on with work. But numbers in this town have begun to talk. The men who keep shops hear it first, in their doors as they swing open. A woman who has always bought £half of bohea every 10 days asks for a £1/4 instead and wants to know when a new shipment will be available at the old price, the grey market price, the price she trusts, because it feels like an arrangement among neighbours rather than a demand from a far room. A clerk who has never paid much mind to politics starts to copy down the dates of arrivals more carefully because customers have started to ask which ships brought which lots and which names are written on the slips pinned to the cargo. It is not that these customers are suddenly educated in trade law. They are sensitive to tone, the way you are when listening to a house creak and knowing by sound whether the wood is settling or splitting. The much-discussed ships enter the harbour like any others, their sailcloth marked by weather and their hulls creaking no more than usual. To the eye they are unremarkable. The difference is in their paperwork and the attention paid to that paperwork by townspeople who generally ignore everything that happens after a captain licks a thumb and smooths a page on a desk. You hear the names of ships as if they were people. One arrives at the end of November, a second in the first week of December, a third only a few days before the frost turns the harbour's edges sharp and bright. You hear that none of them can unload tea until matters are settled, and that they must do so within a strict span, 20 days from arrival, to pay the duty or face the consequence of seizure. The 20 days are not an idea. They are calendar squares marked by candle smoke and by the pressure of 1,000 conversations that all funnel down to a kind of question. What will be done and who will do it? Meetings become the heartbeat of town life. You have gone to many meetings, most of them boring in the useful way meetings are boring. They are long because people speak in order and because order takes time. Boredom is a tool that keeps temperatures low. But now the rooms are too full for that kind of orderly boredom. A larger hall must be found. People who stand outside in the chilly air send messages inside by boys who thread through the crowd with the nimbleness that only thin shoulders and practice can give. The talk you hear is procedural, the language of people who know that procedures are the bones of decision. Who can call the meeting to order if the usual chair refuses? Can we adjourn here and reconvene there? Shall resolutions be read, amended, read again? It feels like too much fuss to some, too slow, too deliberate, and yet the slowness is a way to keep 1,000 thoughts from boiling over. Words are cheaper than broken windows. Time spent listening keeps hands in pockets and feet still. You notice the phrases repeated like footstep wear on a threshold. Consignments must be returned.
No unloading.
No payment of duties. Guard the wharf to ensure no tea slips away by night. The talk is firm but careful. Those who speak in favour of resistance are very clear to say that no harm should come to ships, to their other cargo, or to the men working them. They are not calling for chaos. They are calling for precision. To live in a port is to know that ships are the lungs of a town.
If you stop their breathing altogether, you suffocate yourself.
The plan, such as it is to keep the tea in its chests, to keep it from touching shore, to send it back the way it came, and to demonstrate that an entire town can say no with discipline rather than with fire. That is the ideal. Ideals are tidy. Docks are not. At the wharf, patterns change.
Watches are set.
The same allies you rely on to keep a neighbourhood safe from ordinary pilfering now take shifts to make sure no night unloading occurs.
Lanterns swing in gloved hands as men pace the planks, their breath rising and falling in time with boot steps.
There is a long-standing courtesy on docks, a practice of nods and brief words that allows men to do their work without questions that snag like hooks. These knights bend that custom. Watchers ask more than they used to. They check more gates. They follow the sound of a creaking dolly farther than good manners might ordinarily allow. Work still happens. Ships carry more than tea.
After all, but the tea is like a child in a household when a fever runs. It draws the eye again and again,
even if it is asleep and the room is quiet. You begin to learn the names of the consignees, not because you do business with them, but because their decisions act like stones in a shallow river, altering the course of everything around them. They are men of means, connected to larger circles of power, men who understand that resigning a commission is not merely a personal choice, but a statement with consequences for kin and connections. You can imagine the conversations at their tables, the arguments about duty and destiny, the weighing of risks, the practical concerns about property and position. You can also imagine, and this is a less comfortable thought, the possibility that they feel themselves to be in the right, that the law, which they believe holds society together, requires them to hold steady. You may not share that view, but it helps you to understand the stiffness in their spines. These are not pantomime villains. They are men who interpret words differently. The difficulty lies in making these interpretations fit in one town without tearing the fabric that keeps all of you warm. The governor, too, is a person you know at a distance. His name rolls around tavern tables with a mix of irritation and resignation. He insists on the forms, on the completion of the steps that make law visible. To some, this is stubbornness. To others, it is fidelity. To you, living between the hearth and the wharf, it is a pressure you feel not on your conscience, but on your purse. If ships cannot unload, and if ships cannot leave, then money slows. Boredom becomes worry because boredom is only safe when things are moving underneath it. A stuck harbor turns boredom into strain. You think about small shopkeepers who pay their suppliers with the money from last week's sales. You picture sailors who rotate from ship to ship and who need their pay to buy boots that keep toes from going black in January. You think about a rope walk owner who needs flax and time and orders in a sequence that makes sense. All of that depends on the rhythm of ships. You do not want the tea dispute to become a stop sign on every street. There is a point in early December when the weather contributes its own opinion. It is cold enough that work requires more breaks for hands to thaw, and dark arrives early enough that anyone walking from a meeting to a home outside the town centre must reckon with icy patches and hidden ruts. It is an old truth in New England that weather decides the tempo of human argument as much as words do. Harsh weather shortens tempers and narrows choices. The men who must decide whether to grant clearances, to sign for cargo, to permit a departure, or to hold to rules that were written without a particular December in mind, all feel the season biting at their ears. You find yourself imagining them at their desks, candles guttering, ink thickening, thinking that it would be easier to say yes than to keep saying no. But habit and position are strong. They continue to say no. You try to picture, as a way to settle yourself, the precise mechanics by which a ship might leave without paying the duty on tea that has not been unloaded. You picture a captain asking for his papers, a collector declining to issue them because the protocols say the duty must be assessed or the cargo seized, and you imagine the captain explaining that he will carry the tea away and make this town's quarrel someone else's problem. You imagine the collector trained to see the world as a series of required steps, refusing, and you imagine the captain trained to keep a ship's schedule, fuming. The standoff is bureaucratic, not cinematic. It is a desk between two men. It is a key in a drawer. It is a stamp not applied. All of that is oddly more exhausting than a fight would be. Slow tension wears you down more than a quick blow. As the first ship's deadline approaches, you note how everything funnels to a date. People who had not watched calendars now count days. Even those who do not care about politics find themselves wondering whether the tea will be paid for, whether the ship will be seized, or whether some new arrangement will be made at the last hour, as often happens in towns where pragmatism is the unofficial religion. The meeting hall is crowded again on the day the talk is promised to come to a head. The atmosphere is not festive, but it is charged the way the air feels before snow, thick, expectant, with a hush at the edges that makes noises in the center sound sharper. You stand somewhere in the middle, close enough to hear the main speakers, far enough that you can still feel anonymous. People you recognize from markets and pews are here, mixed with unfamiliar faces drawn in by curiosity or obligation. Speeches proceed in the fashion you expect, firm statements, occasional humor to ease a knot of anger in the crowd, reminders of principles that make listeners nod, and then the necessary recitation of practical measures. You pay attention when men who know ships speak. They are not concerned with philosophy. They talk about water depth, mooring lines, and tides. They talk about how many hands are needed to move heavy chests quickly and how narrow the gangways feel when they are crowded by haste. You realize, as you often do in moments when public life seems about loftier things, that logistics are the marrow of action. People can want a thing very much, can decide it must be done or must be prevented, and still fail if they do not know how to arrange bodies and objects in space and time. Outside, a kind of quiet patrol continues. Men who would otherwise be home trimming wicks take their turn on the wharf because they prefer sacrifice now to chaos later. They do not wear uniforms. They wear the same thick coats they wear to haylofts and to chopping wood. Their presence is a signal more than a guard.
It says that the town is watching.
It says that if a decision is made behind a door, the consequences will be visible in the open, and those who make decisions will be watched in turn. You think, not for the first time, that much of a community's safety comes not from laws, written on paper, but from eyes and from the willingness of people to be present for one another when presence is tedious. The consignees you hear about have been asked, pushed, to resign their role, to ease the tension by stepping aside. Some do not, and some make themselves scarce. You imagine a carriage rattling toward the safety of a fort in the harbour, a place where metal and oath combine to make a wall that ordinary voices cannot penetrate. It is strange to think of neighbours needing refuge from neighbours, and stranger still to accept that so much of what is happening is driven by paper, by signatures, by who will endorse what and when. You turn it over in your mind like a coin you cannot quite see in the dim light. If the tea could simply be sent back, or if a pass could be written to let a ship leave, the pressure would evaporate. But the system is not built for evaporation.
It condenses. It firms up.
It insists. You return home after one such meeting with the peculiar tiredness that comes from standing too long. Your legs ache, and so does your attention. You want small chores because they soak up thought. You check your candles and twist a new wick. You wind a clock and note that its tick has grown uneven, then adjust the weight slightly until it evens out. You cut onions for stew with careful, slow strokes, glad for work that requires your eyes and gives your mind space to cool. While you work, you listen to the small sounds the town makes at night. A wagon in the lane, a dog choosing a corner for its bark, a late passerby walking from tavern to bed. It is a kind of communal sigh. No one wants a break in the pattern. Everyone senses that the pattern is breaking. As the second ship's deadline approaches, the same themes repeat, but louder. The men who have been careful to insist on non-violence are even more careful. They remind everyone that restraint is a choice, renewed every hour, not a blanket thrown over temper, once and for all. They plan for signals, for the flow of information, for keeping actions limited to what is intended. You are struck by the seriousness of this discipline. It is not born of fear alone. It is born of a love of the idea that neighbours can act together without becoming a mob. The line between the two is thin. To keep it bright requires candles and watchfulness, and the humility to accept that not everyone will agree with every step, but that most can agree on boundaries. Now the calendar pulls you toward the middle of December. Cold is not a guest anymore. It is the host. Boots squeak on packed snow on side streets, and the harbour's water looks darker, almost oily, under the low sky. You hear that a third ship has arrived, delayed by sickness on board, its timing adding a kind of last complication to an already tangled knot. You calculate the days by habit now, find yourself counting ahead in your head while you do small tasks, and then shake your mind free because there is little sense in re-adding what everyone already knows. The deadline sits like a weight on all your chests, and the town cannot carry it much longer without deciding whether to set it down gently, to pass it along or to drop it. On the morning of a day that feels like a pivot, you move through town past knots of people speaking softly as if the air itself might be listening for something to take out of context. You catch phrases: duty unpaid, clearance denied, send it back, stand firm. You cross a patch of sunlight that has no heat and think about how often the important moments in community life are administrative. How many times the fate of your neighbours has turned on an office holder's interpretation of a rule rather than on a dramatic rush? It is an odd comfort and an odd frustration. You prefer the predictability of process when it works for you and resent it when it works against you. And you suppose the same is true for those on the other side of this argument. By afternoon, you are back among the crowd in a meeting place that seems somehow to hold more than its physical size could allow. Windows fog with breath. The floorboards register the shifting of weight as people adjust stances and share space. Messages come and go, news of what has been said at the customs office, speculation about the governor's position, practical notes about the wharves and the presence of men stationed to ensure that the tea does not move in secret. The mood is steady rather than feverish, and that steadiness feels to you like the last level moment before a hill breaks downward. Everyone has held together for so long, and yet you know that patience, like candles, burns at a rate that obeys no person's wish. As evening approaches, you turn over a final question while you wait for the next report to arrive from the harbour. When the forms have been followed to their end point and the drawers remain closed, when the careful arrangements cannot resolve the conflict because the very arrangement is the conflict, what remains for ordinary people who seek neither glory nor destruction? Do they find a way to act that preserves the town as a place where tomorrow's bread still rises? Or are they drawn into something that will remake the pattern of their days, whether they will it or no? You return to the same kitchen where the kettle's quiet breath has measured countless afternoons, and you take stock the way you always do, by the ledger of small things. Over the last weeks, tea has migrated from the realm of routine into the realm of decision. What you once reached for without thinking now requires a choice, and choices, you know, are never just about the object itself. You look at the caddy, lighter than it would have been in October, and you look at the sugar loaf, pointed like a poor man's monument, its edge nipped down to odd shapes that never fit the tongs quite right. You watch the fire and assess the coal and kindling at hand. It is mid-December cold, the kind that makes your fingers clumsy and your patience thin at the edges, and you remind yourself that patience is not a luxury. It is a household tool. It saves wood by pacing chores and stretches candles by setting the wick straight, and in a town, it keeps ordinary life from breaking while public life is strained. Your neighbours are learning new shopping habits. A woman who used to buy bohea with confidence now stands a moment longer at the counter, her hand on the purse, calculating against a horizon she cannot see. You hear more talk of coffee, which is bitter and less properly handled, and often more expensive by the pound. Some prefer chocolate in the morning, richer and more sustaining, though too costly, to be daily comfort for many. Others return to old herbal habits, infusions of mint, lemon balm, and the sharp, clean scent of sage in hot water. The leaves do not pretend to be tea. They are their own category, a domestic adaptation more than an equivalent. You consider their taste as much as their meaning. An herb cup signals a stance as much as it warms a hand. It says that you can live without a leaf that now carries the weight of an argument you never asked to carry when you first learned to warm the pot. In the streets, the rhythm of labour persists with minor corrections. Rope walks spin their fibres. Coopers curve staves to the familiar arcs that make the barrels' bellies swell gracefully. Carters crunch iron-rimmed wheels over frozen ruts. Bakers keep their pre-dawn covenant with hunger, and yet a gentle drag runs through these tasks, the way a shirt feels when it is slightly damp and sticks to your skin. That drag is uncertainty. Crews talk in low voices about which ships may be seized, which captains are stuck, which cargoes wait on unfavourable tables. Sailors go from tavern to tavern seeking berths and news in equal measure. Shopkeepers look at their back shelves and decide with more care than before whether to order the usual number of bundles or to reduce the risk of tying up coin. Everything is minutely revised and all at once. The town adapts not by replacing its habits but by trimming them, and it is in these trimmings that you feel the cost of what some men in distant rooms call policy. The East India Company remains far away and yet oppressively near. You cannot see its warehouses or its auctions, but you can feel the pressure of its decisions through the price movements in your own neighborhood. You imagine its ledgers as vast, open books where tea is measured not in teaspoons but in tons, and where a line on a page in London becomes a knot of debate on a wharf in Boston. You find it strange and not a little rude that invisible sums can intrude on visible lives so readily. The company did not set out to change the flavor of your afternoons. It set out to solve a cash and stockpile problem. But the solution does not end in the ledgers where it was designed.
Spills, it always spills.
You realize again that economics is a matter of liquids. Tea in cups, ink in books, water in harbors, blood in fingers numbed by wind. Each seeks its level, and the obstacles, laws and taxes only redirect the flow. You listen to stories of those consignees whose names have become a kind of unwanted fame. They retreat to places where their decisions are sheltered by stone and oath. You do not wish them harm any more than you wish harm to those who speak against them. You wish that the arrangement could have been adjusted without making private life public. It is an old wish, and the world rarely grants it. Meanwhile, neighbors who never spoke of such matters talk about resignations and commissions over stew pots and at washtubs, the way one might compare recipes. The language of governance has entered the kitchen by way of tea, and once a new language enters a room, it does not soon leave. At your table, you test substitutes. Coffee, with more attention than you used to give it, becomes a ritual in its own right if you commit to the patience it demands. You roast the beans, learning to listen for the crack that means heat has persuaded them to become themselves. You grind them, first too fine, then too coarse, calibrating by taste. You boil water carefully and pour steadily, noticing that the best cup rewards a steady hand more than the best tea ever did. It takes time. Perhaps that is the point. Time spent on preparation is time not spent on fretting. Herbal drinks are a different art, a collaboration with a neighbor's garden or a patch of your own. Lemon balm and mint cannot carry milk or sugar as convincingly as tea, and they do not bring the same clarity to a sleepy head at dawn, but they fill a cup and help fulfill the social promise of offering something to a guest. You notice the way your palms wrap differently around a mug of steeped leaves gathered in summer and dried on a string by the hearth. Less expectation, more acceptance. These substitutions teach you about resilience. You had not planned to learn that lesson in such domestic terms, but what else is resilience than the willingness to learn a recipe you did not intend to need? You do not romanticize it. There are limits to substitution. Coffee is dear. Chocolate is only sometimes in budget. Herbs fade in winter. Some will continue to buy legal tea because price is price and taste is taste. Some will seek the old channels that now carry heavier risk. But the range of choices broadens even as procuring any one item becomes harder. Freedom, you think, is not only the right to speak, it is the capacity to improvise when the shelf does not hold what it used to. As for the ships, their deadlines come like clock chimes. You hear that one can neither unload nor leave, and then another faces the same condition, and then another arrives and complicates the pattern. You find yourself thinking of a child's game where sticks are piled, and players take turns removing one while trying not to collapse the stack. The rules are not quite the same, but the feeling is tension contained just barely by the care of many hands. The town continues to prefer the careful path, stand guard, hold the chests aboard, refuse the duty, request the return. The governor continues to prefer the established steps, no clearances without proper assessment, no departures while the matter remains unresolved. These preferences are not abstract. They are seen in paper and in footfalls and in the vapor of breath under early dark. Your own house registers these larger movements in small ways. The new boy learns to sweep without leaving that stubborn stripe down the middle of the steps. You measure candles with more frugality and move them closer to their work, so their glow need not waste itself on empty air. You save more kitchen scraps for broth and let the simmer run longer when wood supply permits. Flavor, you find, is the art of patience, too. Your ledger acquires extra marks next to items that used to be routine. You develop a habit of setting a coin aside each market day as if building a small levee against an uncertain flood. You mend a coat more carefully and teach a child to turn a cuff to hide fray. All of this is ordinary, and yet it feels charged now because the reason for the care is shared by so many at once. A town bent to thrift as a choice feels different from a town pressed to thrift by a quarrel. In the first case, thrift is a virtue. In the second, thrift is a strategy. You think, at odd moments, about the other side of the ocean where tea begins as plant and labor. You picture hands moving quickly along rows of green. You picture the weight of baskets and the motion of drying leaves that must be coaxed just so to acquire the flavors you recognize by smell even before you add water. These imagined hands are far from your own, and the chain that connects them to your cup winds through too many rooms to track. Still, you recognize a kinship. Somewhere another person has done a day's work that becomes your rest, and you have done work whose end another person may not ever see. That web of exchanges makes daily life possible. The present quarrel is about the terms of those exchanges. You wish the debate stayed at the level of terms and never at the level of lives. You do not want anyone's work to be wasted. You want work to pass cleanly from hand to hand and be honored by honest pay. On the day when the talk seems to compress into decision, you are not in the room where the most consequential words are uttered. Most people never are. You are in a nearby room or a street or your own kitchen close to the window, listening and wondering what will reach you and how fast. The town has tried meetings and messages, petitions and patrols. You have tried substitutions and savings and steadiness. You are fond of steadiness. It has held you upright through other storms. You wonder how many storms can be met with steady patience before the weather itself forces a different method, and whose job it is to declare that the method must change. You would not volunteer for that role. You are a caretaker of rooms and routines. You consent to public shifts only when private persistence cannot hold. Even as you think this, you re-examine your vocabulary. Words like duty and drawback and consignment once marked the edges of your interest. Now they sit near the center. A duty is not only a tax, it is an obligation, and the two meanings pull against one another in your mind. Your obligation to neighbor, to family, to the idea that people here should shape their own arrangements, competes with the obligation the law says you owe to a structure designed elsewhere. You try to keep your understanding practical. Which obligation keeps the most people fed, housed, and unafraid? Which obligation protects the quiet competencies on which everything else depends? The way a midwife's calm hands know a pattern, the way a cooper's eye knows a curve, the way a cook knows the right moment to lift the kettle off the hook. These are the skills that do not write petitions and yet bear the consequences of them. In this season, you notice more gratitude for ordinary durability. A pair of boots that keeps out slush is a small miracle. A good latch is a kind of peace treaty between wind and wood. A well-sealed jar of preserves is a bargaining chip against a bear market stall. Even the habit of folding a linen towel precisely before bed feels like an insistence that a house will remain a house and not become a set of loosely stacked parts. You are convinced that such small conservative acts are not opposition to change, but the precondition for wise change. They keep people decent. They slow the rush to harm. They remind a town that a tomorrow exists and must be planned for. Even when the air is full of news, before long, people will tell the story of this month in simplified shapes. The company and the act. The ships and the deadlines, the crowd and the consequences. You will remember those shapes, of course, and you will admit their usefulness. But you will also remember that the story was built from smaller bricks, a shop counter where a customer hesitated, a wharf patrol where men with cold hands shared a flask and counted shadows, a kitchen where a woman tried lemon balm because it was what she had, a set of ledgers where someone placed a dot next to a line and hoped the ink would be read as patience instead of as fear. You will remember that the loud moments are supported by a scaffolding of quiet ones, and that what lasts in a community is the muscle memory of cooperation, even when cooperation is in the service of saying no. It would be easy to imagine that the meaning of tea has been exhausted by these past weeks. You have weighed it as beverage, as budget item, as symbol, as rope in a tug of war. And yet you find one more meaning when you consider the mornings cold and early, when you choose to drink nothing at all and go straight to work. In those hours, your body becomes the signal. Abstention speaks where consumption once did. Tea's absence alters your day as much as its presence used to. The empty space creates room for new habits, more water heated and cooled for cleanliness, more careful tracking of sleep so that morning fog can be met without a stimulant, more reliance on neighborly visits where the cup matters less than the conversation. You do not claim that these new habits are better, only that they teach you something about your own flexibility and about how communities adapt, not by replacing their furniture overnight, but by rearranging it and discovering, with a mixture of discomfort and pride, that the room still holds. When you sit at last, near the hour that marks afternoon slide toward evening, you hold a warm cup of something, coffee perhaps, or an herbal mix that tastes greener than you would like, and you watch the way light falls on the table. The oak has absorbed years of worry and years of celebration without changing grain. There are dents that recall heavy plates set down too quickly, and rings that show where someone forgot to use a coaster before anyone taught that word to children. The table does not keep accounts, it keeps shape. You take comfort from that, from the endurance of objects that ask only to be used and cleaned and used again. You think that people should be more like tables and less like arguments. You do not always succeed at this, but the thought steadies you. Tomorrow there will be news again, there always is, and the day after, and the day after that. You think beyond this month to winter proper and then to spring. Gardens will be turned, and markets will fill with greens again, and someone will find a way to make a brittle season interesting by inventing a new pastry or a better way to patch a boot. You distrust headlines as a way to live. You prefer calendars and recipes. Still you accept that the months ahead will carry the aftertaste of this time, and that even if tea returns to your shelf without complication, you will taste the memory of complication with it for a while. Memory lingers in the tongue. You reach for your ledger and make a neat note about candles, about the remaining coffee, about the portion of sugar still wrapped in blue paper that you will save, as always, for windows on the dullest days. You write more carefully than usual, steadying the quill, reminding yourself that tidy entries do not make events tidy, but do make you calmer. You end your note with a small list of errands: fetch more flour, check on a neighbor's ailing child, ask after a sailor's wife whose rent is due next week. You add, almost as an afterthought, a line that you cross out and write again because you do not like its sound. Consider whether to buy tea if the price shifts. You leave the thought unresolved on the page. You think that some decisions are best made at the last possible moment, when the shape of the day reveals the right angle of approach. You stand, pour the last of the hot water into the basin for washing up, and watch steam cloud the window. Your fingers prickle as heat returns to them. You think about the chapter that is closing. Whatever its exact ending turns out to be in the town's official version. And you think about the next chapter, which has already begun without anyone naming it as such. The habit of naming comes after living. You trust that sequence. You dry your hands on the linen towel you folded before, and smooth its edge, because smoothing edges is how you care for yourself when margins are rough elsewhere. You breathe in and out, measure, then loosen. You tell yourself that you will keep a cup near, and a candle trimmed, and a neighbor in mind, and you will let the larger matters run their course without allowing them to swallow the house. You blow out the candle because dusk has carried enough light into the room to work by another few minutes, and you murmur a question that has followed you all month, changing shape but not substance. When ordinary rituals are forced to carry the weight of a public quarrel, do those rituals break under the load, or do they reveal a strength you did not know they had? And if they reveal that strength, how long can you ask it to hold before you must choose not between beverages but between ways of belonging to your town? You arrive in a room where politics smells like damp wool and candle smoke. The space is crowded past its comfort, the windows clouded by human breath, the pews and benches holding more weight than their makers intended. You stand near a pillar because pillars feel like allies when crowds grow dense, and you listen to a steady, practiced ritual unfold in a tone that favors procedure over passion. This is a meeting in the way a kitchen is a kitchen. It contains tools, heat, and hands trained by repetition. The men at the front speak plainly and slowly, not to stir hearts, but to count heads, to put matters into order, to test resolutions as a carpenter tests a joint, gently and more than once. Outside, the air is colder than it needs to be to demand quick decisions. Inside, the warmth encourages patience, though patience is a resource that must be rationed like lamp oil in a long winter. The legal frame has shifted, and you are asked to notice it not because law excites you, but because law determines how much you must adjust your own day. The question on the table is not whether tea is good, goodness is beside the point, but whether the arrangements for receiving it are acceptable. The men called consignees have been named by a company across an ocean, and though their task is straightforward on paper, the paper presses against the character of this place like a boot against ice. You sense in the measured voices how much effort it takes to keep a crowd within boundaries that hold courtesy and resolve together. The chair calls for quiet. A clerk reads. Pages rustle like a small storm contained in a sack. The words are formal, because formality gives shape to emotion without denying it. The 20-day clock, invisible but tyrannical, ticks in every mind even as the speeches pretend to be timeless. You know the rule by now. A ship admitted to harbour has 20 days to discharge certain obligations, or the cargo is subject to seizure. That sentence, dry as a shelf of stale bread, has become the key by which the town measures its sanity. The first ship arrived when November was rubbing sleep from its eyes and preparing to leave. Another followed in the short grey days. A third found the harbour as the cold settled into a rhythm that scolds the bones. Each ship carried tea, only some of what they carried, and not the most dangerous substance in the world, but the most discussed. Each ship is now tangled in the rule. They cannot unload without crossing a line the meeting refuses to cross, and they cannot depart without permission that the law refuses to grant. So the law has made itself a knot, and the town has called itself a pair of patient hands determined to untie it without breaking the cord. In the markets, where apples roll smoothly into barrels and cod lies stiff and honest on beds of shaved ice, the 20-day rule is discussed with the same gravity as prices. You hear it in the way people add days up on their fingers while standing in the queue for bread, the way some men squint as if trying to see dates floating in air above the street. Mid-December begins to feel like a person in the room, a visitor whose arrival is inevitable and whose departure will carry a consequence no one can fully picture. You are attentive to the choreography of events that must coordinate like a dance. Meetings here, messages carried there, a rider sent to make an ask at a house outside town, lanterns lit along the wharves where the planks sing under boots. It is not theatrical. It is work that uses many small motions to avoid a single large one. The merchants you know are cautious with their voices and their ledgers. They do not speak in slogans. They speak in margins and replenishment schedules, in sea worm damage to dock pilings, and in the amount of hemp needed to keep rope walks profitable. They are capable of indignation, but their indignation is braided with arithmetic. If ships stall, credit stalls. If credit stalls, households stall. You watch one of them walk the line between principle and prudence, nodding at resolutions while glancing at the window where the light fades in a way that signals tides rather than ideas. He has buyers waiting in Salem, suppliers delayed in New York, and a partner whose wife is due to deliver a child. He wants the town to be clever enough to insist on its rights and careful enough not to knock over the table where everyone's accounts rest. The wharves are more crowded by watchers than usual, and the watchers are neighborly rather than menacing. They carry their habitual duties into a new register. They count trunks, check gates, and ask subtle questions disguised as greeting. Lantern light puts halos around woolen caps. Frost lays its thin, delicate grammar across coils of rope stacked beside bollards. You pace with them for an hour one night and learn how silence can be a form of labor. One man points quietly at the silhouettes of 3 ships and ticks off their names without raising his voice. Another knows which hatches belong to which holds and which holds contain what. A third carries a list, and the list is not a list of targets. It is a list of reminders. The aim is to keep tea still, not to injure ships. Restraint is a tool that needs tending. You admire the men who tend it. Inside the rooms where meetings continue, the discipline of process is both comfort and frustration. Those who call for votes invoke phrases that breach the boundary between domestic and public spheres, using words like duty and obligation with the double meaning that might apply to a parent or to a taxpayer. Those who prefer caution ask for adjournment rather than rupture. You hear your own ambivalence echoed in the voices around you. You would like the matter resolved without a change in your morning routine. You also understand that routine is made possible by decisions you do not directly make, and that if you do not weigh in through presence, those decisions may be made in a way that disrespects your presence anyway. So you stand and listen, patient, in the rough cloak of your own common sense, feeling the weight of wages in your pocket and the lightness of your tea caddy at home. A notable part of each meeting is the time spent explaining the same thing again. It is not redundancy for its own sake. It is the work of keeping a common understanding alive. Someone in the back asks for the 3rd time what it would mean to send the ships away with their tea still aboard.
A voice at the front explains again that papers cannot be given while matters remain unsettled,
and that the men whose duty it is to issue papers will not step beyond the lines they inhabit as if the lines were drawn on the floor in chalk. Another question, asked without malice, wonders whether the consignees might yet resign, and the answer returns like a stone skipping back across water, lighter with each bounce but travelling still. The repetition is dull and kind. It keeps anger from igniting in corners where oxygen is heavy and the wood is dry. You notice the young in the room, boys scarcely taller than the rail at the end of the pews, faces alert, eyes quick, bodies perfectly still in the way that effort can make them. They look from speaker to speaker as if the distance between sentence and sentence were a rope they could someday climb. At their feet sit baskets with apples and crusts that children will share if the meeting goes long. You think about how these boys will remember this winter when they themselves are men with grey in their hair, and how their stories will be shaped less by what they understood than by what they felt. The press of bodies, the dignity of order, the declaration that neighbours can coordinate without an overseer. You know that memory often turns management into myth. You hope that the myth that results from this time will be kind to the management that sustains daily life. In your own house, the consequences of this slow drama show up as small substitutions and postponed purchases. A button is moved from one cuff to another. A piece of ribbon is saved for mend rather than flare. You time a journey to market by the fear that a crowd might grow and block your way home at dusk.
None of this is dire.
It is only different. You do not want different to be the default. You want the ordinary to be ordinary, and you will work to keep it so. You plan meals conservatively, not because you anticipate hunger, but because you want the satisfaction of plenty to arrive, as it always has, by the good sense of a cook, not by the whims of a governor, or a clerk, or a firm with warehouses on a river you have never seen. You think often, as the 20-day mark draws close for the first ship, about the nature of a decision that is also a date. There is something in you that resists the idea that a calendar should set the terms by which a community must act, and yet you know that calendars are how the communal lives in the body. They rally uncertainty into a line. They say, by this time, something must be settled, even if it is only the decision to accept the unsettledness for a few days more. The men at the front of the room avoid predicting outcomes. They refuse categories like victory and defeat. They prefer terms that farmers would use about weather, not soldiers about battle. Their modesty is deliberate, and it reassures you more than any promise could. On the last night before a meeting that will mark the day everyone has been counting toward, you bank your hearth and consider your responsibilities. Your duty to your house includes being able to walk to the well and back without worry, to price flour with a clear eye, to mop up spills and keep stair treads clear for the safety of small feet. Your duty to your town includes showing up, following the sense of a common decision when made, and not making more noise than necessary when the work is delicate. The tea chests in the harbour have placed these duties in a strange alignment. You cannot fulfill the one without attending to the other. You accept that alignment with the same practicality with which you accept a snowfall in March, annoyed, resigned, unwilling to let it change what must be done. Morning returns, and with it the crowd, and with the crowd the words, and with the words the slow push toward whatever the evening will hold. You will go where your neighbours go and lend your weight to steadiness. You ask once more the question that has sat quietly at the edge of your attention since the first ship dropped anchor. When a rule written far away encounters a room full of people who must live with it every hour, which gives way first, the rule, the patience, or the hour? You spend the morning not at the meeting but on errands that keep a house and a livelihood stitched together. A stop at the Cooper's where barrel hoops lie like rib cages along the wall. A visit to the rope walk where the air is the cleanest kind of dusty and the floor seems to lengthen as the men twist strands into strength. A pause at a stall where a woman sells winter apples and a thin line of pickles gleams behind glass.
Even as you buy and barter, your ears feel tuned to another frequency, one that carries scraps of news as if the town were a single instrument thrumming at a single note.
You catch phrases and assemble them like a quilt. A rider gone to argue, a collector holding fast, a governor consulted at a distance, a deadline that has moved from notion to weight. Each piece on its own would mean little. Together they make a blanket under which the day draws its knees. By midday you are back in the swarming heart of deliberation, and the talk has moved from general refusal to specific attempts. A ship's owner has been urged to seek permission to leave with his cargo still aboard, to carry the tea away in the same boards that brought it. It is the kind of solution you prefer, orderly, undamaging, a reversal that knocks nothing down. But solutions require permissions, and permissions require signatures, and signatures require a willingness to shoulder responsibility for what those letters will cause. The man sent to obtain that signature has ridden out of town, horse blowing steam, hooves striking out a rhythm that calms him even as it agitates you. The rooms fill with the patience of those who have done what they can for the hour and must now wait. Waiting has its own geography. Men stand near doors because fresh air is steadier in corridors. Boys position themselves near windows because light falls there, painting the wood with a kind of mercy that makes hours feel shorter. The clerk takes care to sit, to save strength for when his hand must keep up with the speech that will return, and he folds his papers with a kind of affection that suggests his tools are more than tools. You shift your weight only when your legs insist. There is a murmur at the rear, not of dissent but of bodies adjusting, of coughs being held back, of discipline being kept. Someone passes a basket of small loaves and a knife. Someone else passes a jug whose contents are not announced. The room holds the line. The rider returns because riders always return. That is their job, and the words he carries are short and hard. A refusal. A refusal dressed in courtesy and law, but a refusal nonetheless.
Papers cannot be issued. Conditions have not been met.
The man who must sign will not reach beyond the shape of his duty as he conceives it. The messenger's breath is still fast. His hair clings to his forehead. He looks older by an hour's ride than he did when he left. The sound that moves through the room is not a groan, but something quieter. A close-mouthed acceptance that the most elegant way forward has once again been set aside by the stubbornness of form. In response, the town does what it has done all along. It adjusts the plan without changing the principle. A new attempt is forwarded. Another office will be visited. Another set of words will be tried. You watch this with a kind of incredulity that makes you proud. It's not naivety. It is a practiced willingness to test every path before stepping into the one that cannot be undone. You have heard some whisper about action that would dramatize conclusions others refuse to state, but the whisper is scolded into silence by those who remind the room that the first duty is to preserve the ship, the dock, the day, the town. No harm to hull a hand? It has been said so often that it has become a vow. The wharf keeps time to this rhythm. Men posted there count the hours using ropes, how stiff they feel at dusk, how pliant at noon, using the calls of gulls, using the rise and fall of their own energy. They ensure what can be ensured. No cask is moved that should not be, no bulkhead is opened that must remain closed, no petty theft is mistaken for the main event. You stand with them one evening and notice how much of keeping order depends on the polite assumption that everyone can see everyone else. You notice, too, how men who are not particularly friendly toward one another in ordinary times now share the same plank length without complaint. Common purpose makes generous neighbors of those who yesterday argued about a missing hen or a disputed fence line. There is, as the deadline presses, a tremor beneath the town's surface that even the most disciplined cannot fully still. It is not fear exactly. It is the knowledge that order is a thing that must be actively maintained. It is easier to wash a floor than to prevent mud from being tracked in. It is easier to mend a tear than to stop a sleeve from catching on a nail. The town's leaders, practical to a degree that would be comic in another context, prepare for the possibility that their careful balance will be upset not by a plan, but by an impatience. Signals are established that are meant to be read only if events take a turn beyond the planned path. You do not ask the content of the signals. It is enough to know that someone has bothered to think of them. On a day when the light disappears so early, it feels like a discourtesy. Word passes that the latest appeal has been made at the highest practical level available and has again returned without the answer hoped for. The ownership of the problem, like a hot kettle with a poor handle, has been passed back and forth until the hands that hold it are tired. The town resumes its waiting in a sorrow that is almost restful, the sorrow of those who have done enough for the moment and who will not be ashamed of what happens, because they will know they were as patient as circumstances allowed. Room is made for prayer by those inclined to it, and for silent cursing by those who are not. No one is asked to taste their neighbor's spice in this matter. You find yourself thinking of the tea itself, asleep in its cases. Wood around leaf, leaf within paper, paper within wood, wood within water, water within cold. What a fortress has been built around something as light as dried plant matter. How narrow the gap has become between a beverage and a principle. You imagine a chest being opened in some other town on some other day, and the same leaves pouring out without consequence, heat uniting with scent to make weary men kind again. You do not resent the leaves. You resent the way human arrangements have made a leaf into an emblem. You wish for ordinary steeping and the steam that makes spectacles fog and conversations slow and respectable. As the afternoon trickles into evening on the day, whose name everyone knows without speaking it, you walk through streets humming with subdued attention, and enter a space that has held more words in a week than some churches hold in a year. The tone begins as it always has, respectful, orderly, precise. A report is given, the words falling like cold drops from a roof. Refused, denied, withheld. No exit found through doors tried. The men at the front exchange glances shaped by months of shared labor. They have fewer words left to spend on this stage of the problem, and words are a coin that, used unwisely, buy trouble. You listen for what comes next and hear, not a shout, but the small sound a piece of cloth makes when it is turned, an almost silent swish that means a garment is being adjusted in preparation for movement. It is such a minor sound that if you were not listening for nothing, you would never notice it. The room has held the intention of restraint as if it were a cheerful child. Now it holds a different intention as if it were a tool fetched from a high shelf. You cannot be sure whether the tool will be used. You can be sure only that it has been taken down, held, weighed in a hand that knows how much it can do and how much it can break. At the threshold of whatever the next hour will bring, with lanterns waiting, with planks ready to sound under purposeful steps, with men who have spent themselves on asking now facing the absence of an answer, you pose to yourself a question it seems the entire town is asking in the same silent, resistant way. If every avenue of patience has been travelled to its end and the road has stopped at a closed gate that no key will open, what action, limited, deliberate, and as merciful as possible, remains to people who want tomorrow to look like a place where families can still count their candles and their cups? You wake to a day that does not yet understand. It will be remembered. The town is ordinary at first glance. A cart creaks past your door, its iron rims ringing lightly over stones. A woman sweeps her stoop with the intensity cold weather demands. Boys race a length of lane with hands wrapped in scarves, each breath a puff of temporary cotton in the air. You fold the morning into its proper shape, bank the hearth, measure flour for noon bread, tie up a parcel to take to a neighbor, and then you pause, feeling a second rhythm beneath the town's usual beat. It is a pulse set not by bells or clocks, but by the count of days you have all been keeping. The 20-day clock, which once felt like a rule written on the back of commerce, has become a living presence, a stern guest sitting at every table. Today, patience must either be rewarded or spend itself to its last copper. You make your way toward the familiar meeting space by the same path you have trod for weeks, past a rope walk where men twist strength out of fiber with long, even motions, past a cooper's yard where staves lean like tall, thoughtful men in conversation, past a yard where carts are tipped on their sides and mended wheels show their circles against a low winter sun. These sights, so practical they nearly pray for you, remind you that the town's life is not built from speeches. It is built from motions repeated until they become a kind of benediction. The repeated motions at the meeting house, call to order, reading, debate, decision, are a cousin to these crafts. They shape community the way staves shape a barrel's curve. Inside, the air is a weight of human closeness, threaded with candle smoke and the low patience of men who have decided that tight quarters and the slow pace of process are now their chosen virtues. You step into the room, and the floor receives your weight with the same hollow complaint it has offered for years. The chair calls for quiet with a gesture so practiced it is nearly familial. A clerk reads a report. There is nothing new in the report, and everything new. Another attempt made, another polite refusal, another description of circumstances unchanged. You feel it like the last sentence of a chapter that insists on being reread before the page may be turned. The insistence is not cruelty. It is the nature of careful people to exhaust every route before they consider the next. Men who have kept their voices low for weeks now speak with a calm that has deepened rather than frayed. They remind the room of the resolution shared across many days and dozens of hours. No unloading of taxed tea, No payment of the duty, no damage to ships, no harm to sailors or their captains, no violence to ordinary business beyond the necessary guarding of the wharf at night. The refrain lands with the comfort and the power of a psalm. It is not piety. It is discipline, and it has made a community strong enough to resist its own heat. The greatest achievement thus far has been the refusal to become a story that ruins other stories, the refusal to let a crowd's anger become a neighborhood's loss. You observe, with a household mind, how the smaller mechanics of order carry the larger intention. The clerk has sharpened his quill twice already, a sign that the morning will be long. A boy slips between bodies to deliver a folded note, then takes up a place by a dripping window and folds his arms around himself, steady as a fence post. A man at the back holds up 2 fingers, a sign to his neighbor perhaps, that 2 men have returned from the wharf with word that everything remains as it should. Little signals like this, nearly domestic in their familiarity, make an unwieldy room behave like a kitchen where the evening meal is being composed. Each ingredient is accounted for, and heat is applied in stages. By midday, the talk turns, as it has turned many times, to the hope that a ship might be granted clearance to quit the harbour, with the tea still sleepily stowed in its chests. It is a hope you have come to love for its tidy mercy. Departure harms no hull. Departure satisfies the clock. Departure returns the leaf to the stream that brought it. But, as has been explained and explained again, departure requires the opening of a drawer and the application of a seal by a man who, from the start, has treated his duty like a narrow, high bridge. He will not step aside. He will not look down. He will not consider that the bridge is not the only way across. He's not a monstrous man. He is a rigid one, and that can be just as unfortunate when the road narrows and the weather sets its teeth. You eat a crust, the top hard with the brittle honesty of yesterday's loaf, and you wash it with a swallow from a small jug passed without comment. You think of neighbours who would prefer not to be here at all and are here anyway, out of reverence for the idea that they should not be spoken for by men they did not choose. You think of men who would prefer to be here day and night, and who have graciously accepted the slow rhythm of process because they know that victory snatched, rather than earned, spoils the mouth. You think of children, and of the way they will remember the weight of breaths in this room, the way their fathers' coats grew damp from interior weather, the way candle stubs were replaced before they guttered, not because anyone was sentimental about candles, but because they stood for carefulness. A rumour moves like a low wind along the back wall. New word from the governor's circle. No change in posture, no release from the form. You feel the acceptance move through the room as each face recalibrates. Some shoulders lift and fall once, an almost silent shrug. A few heads tip forward for a breath, as if scenting the floor, to find whether the wood at least will be steady beneath them. You learn again that acceptance does not always mean agreement. It can mean ranking your tools and setting aside the one you prefer when it has proved useless in the present task. The tool set aside is pleading. The tool taken up is action. It is lifted not with joy, not with triumph, not with the greed of a moment, but with the flat, responsible hands of people who mean to set it down again as soon as they can. You choose your place as afternoon leans toward a thin winter dusk. You stand by a door where air is cooler and where you can step quickly if the room's intention becomes movement. The speakers, men who would rather read accounts than lead them, set out again the terms you have come to treat as household commandments. If what must be done is done, it must be done cleanly.
No looting.
No touching cargo that is not the point in question.
No drinking.
No striking except to prevent theft or harm.
No damage to rigging or hull.
The words land with the plain click of a latch slipping into place. You have heard a latch 1,000 times. It never becomes dramatic. It always becomes secure. Now, in this narrow, thickening hour, an ordinary detail announces itself to you with the insistence of the small boots. You look around and note how many men have taken care to come shod for work, rather than for a long stand. That is not conclusion enough. It is simply a sign that you are not the only person in the room who believes that intention must be clothed. You notice, too, how pocket bulges sit higher than usual and of a shape that suggests a hand axe or a wooden mallet rather than a folded letter. No one shows these tools. No one mentions them. No one says a word about dress or disguise or anything theatrical at all. Drama is the enemy of success in a town like this. The only costume desired is anonymity. The light outside fails in sheets rather than in a single movement. The windows become mirrors. Candle stubs are replaced by a boy whose hands are so sure he could perform the task in the dark. A murmur at the door is misread as intention and then corrected as two latecomers squeeze into a gap near the wall. You are struck by the gentleness of this correction. The room wants no accidental spark. Words are the tinder here. They must be set down carefully. Then a familiar figure speaks a sentence you have come to associate with endings, a sentence crafted to sound like resignation and function like a key. The meeting, he says, can do nothing more. You do not cheer that line. You acknowledge it with silence as one acknowledges the final stitch in a seam before knotting thread. It is not permission.
It is a boundary, out in the cold that tightens lungs and makes doors complain.
The town's movement redistributes itself from a vertical stack of bodies in a room to a long, low flow along streets and down to boards that have, for decades, known what to do with purposeful feet.
Lanterns bob.
Footfalls thud the way a heart thuds when a decision has been made privately and now presents itself outwardly. You walk part way and then stop as you planned because your place is witness and neighbor rather than actor. Others pass you with faces unremarkable on purpose, coats plain, hats ordinary. No one wants to be recognized later as anything other than a citizen who kept faith with a rule he did not write and a town he must continue to inhabit tomorrow. You listen to the water slapping pilings with the humble sound that never tires of itself. You watch the mast tops sway slightly like careful men thinking. You smell tar and rope and a faint sweetness you cannot place until you remember that other cargoes wait and that not everything here is wrapped in dispute. The very fact of that truth, a hold full of some completely honest thing like molasses or oranges or flax, steals you. Dispute must be managed so that honest things can continue. That is what this has always been about for you. It has never been an idea more than it has been a duty to keep the town a place where ships come and go and children learn to count by casks and not by casualties. The hour tips. Steps become more deliberate. Voices lower to prevent their own echo from betraying intent. A few shapes break away from the mass of neighbors and move down a gangway with the practiced caution of men who have hauled, scrubbed, and repaired on these very boards. They do not move like theatre, they move like work. If a signal gave them courage, it was not shouted, it was read in the faces of men who had spent every other possible coin. You stand fixed in the cold and understand without being told that a page is turning, and that once turned, it will reveal not a new story altogether, but a new line in the same story, a line written by hands that have, for weeks, ached to remain folded in pockets and now unclose themselves with reluctant certainty. You tuck your hands into your sleeves to hold the heat, and you ask yourself a question that will not leave you even if this night passes without harm. When a community has carried patience to the farthest point it will go, and finds only a locked gate there, can an act designed to protect the ordinary life of the town be done without changing that ordinary life into something it can never fully return to again? And if not, what measure of change are you willing to accept so that your Children may keep the habit of counting candles instead of counting commands. You begin the night not at the wharf, but in the faintly fevered calm that precedes it, when the streets learn a new kind of quiet. Lamps burn steadily without show. Doors open and close with the careful touch of hands that have boiled water in the dark and know how to move without noise. You pass a window where an old man sits trimming a wick with a penknife and squinting into flame to judge if the light has found its best shape. You pass another where a woman lifts a kettle and tilts it to test for weight, a motion so practiced she could read its contents in the sound alone. The town has reduced itself to its most useful selves, people who know their tools and set them in order before the work begins. Down toward Griffin's Wharf. The wooden city that floats beside the wooden city that stands on land reveals its own anatomy. 3 ships are named in your mind as if they were acquaintances met so many times you no longer need to be introduced. One that has waited the longest with its cargo of tea, a kind of patient irritant, under its deck. Another that came later, equally tangled in the rules. And a third delayed by sickness to arrive as if it meant to complicate a pattern already complex enough. You remember their silhouettes by now, how their masts knit with the sparse stars, how their yards lie like outstretched arms against a grey sky that prefers sleep. You catalogue not romance but logistics, gangways, hatches, ladders, the distance from hatch to deck to rail. The route a man would take if he meant to move quickly and to do no damage. On the wharf, the boards speak under boots in their old language, a hollow, forgiving tone that offers warning and welcome without accusation. You stand a little way off where tar's sweet. Heavy promise mixes with tide and a faint hint of something else. Molasses, perhaps? Or fruit? Reminders that these ships are small floating markets when the world is not arguing with itself. Men arrive without arriving, one and then another, not in a rush, but like drops of rain that, before you admit it, have become weather. They have taken trouble to be ordinary, that being the surest disguise. Some carry small axes tucked inside coats, handles extending only the length a palm can conceal. Some wear old blankets or darkened face and hair, not to claim to be anyone else, but to be no one whose mother would be pained to recognize him. The point is not theatre, it is erasure. Memory fails when faces are fitted to an intent rather than a name. You think of tools. A chest is wood. Wood respects certain kinds of persuasion more than others. A narrow blade beneath the lid to lift it, a hand axe to split it, a mallet to shock the iron bands that hold it. If opened properly, the tea within is bales of dense, crisp leaves, each parcel eager to explode into looseness under wrong touch. To cast it quickly into the water without cluttering the deck takes method. Open, tilt, guide, and, if necessary, stomp the floating clumps back toward the sea so that nothing drifts back to shore like a dog that refuses to leave a yard. You have heard, over weeks, men analyze this, not as drama, but as a craft problem, the way a cooper solves an ellipse or a ropemaker calculates twist. The men here tonight have listened well. They have considered kettles and brooms as much as they have considered laws, the captains of the ships, honest men with more patience than their crews and more worries than their wives know, have been visited and warned over the days before. They are assured that their ships will be respected, that no line will be cut, that no spar will be scored, that the work will be done in a manner that spares a captain the shame of either complicity or resistance.
It is an odd courtesy extended by a town that wishes to say no to the cargo and yes to the vessel.
But odd courtesy is what keeps towns from becoming camps. Tonight, that courtesy will be tested by the cold, by dark, by the friction of bodies and boards and anxiety. All along the waterfront, watchmen who, in other seasons, would be named for their street or their trade, take a turn at being simply neighbours. They know what is planned and what is not planned, and they keep their eyes for the border between the two. A boy is caught peering too eagerly and is given a task: run a line of words to a man at the far end of the wharf, on the logic that energy directed burns cleaner than curiosity suppressed. Men positioned at the edges of the wharves mark who goes where without writing it down. Their ledger is the feel of a night's pattern, the balance between the number needed on a deck and the number who would arrive if rumour led in place of plan. You stand with your back against a stack of hogsheads to avoid being read as one more body moving toward the gangways. Your job is what it has been for weeks, to be a hinge between house and harbour, to carry later the proof that this night did not break the town's own rules. You listen.
You count.
The work begins not with a shout or a signal given by an arm, but with a tightening of the air, the way a sail tightens when a new wind touches it. Boards thud under feet, moving in a cadence learned on farms and rope walks. The sound is not unlike the beat used when men carry a coffin down icy steps. Care is built into it. The line that forms at the first hatch does not need to be told where to stand. They know from the 5 dozen small tasks they perform each week how to take turns around a single point. On deck, small knots of men fall into the grammar of labour. One pries, one lifts, one pulls, one tips. It is the sort of work you would assign in a kitchen if you meant to strip a harvest and make preserves before night stole the light. One washes, one cuts, one spices, one stirs. You once believed you were not the sort of person to think in analogies. The last month has turned you into someone who sees in every household motion a rehearsal for public ones. That notion steadies you as you watch shadows collaborate. The chest lids give with a petulant sound, a complaint that no one has time to attend to. The tea appears in tight blocks that separate in a whispering crumble under cold hands. A bass note of scent rises. The dry, almost floral constant that has warmed so many rooms and will, within moments, meet a different element. The first parcels arc out and splash. The sound is not dramatic. It is a series of plops and hisses as leaves meet water and surrender their tidiness to the harbour's indifferent chemistry. You are close enough to hear admonitions murmured when a man moves out of rhythm. Careful, belt it tighter, pass it forward, mind your feet. You are close enough to see a man hesitate with a piece of wood in his hand that is not part of the chest. He looks at it, the right size for some later chore at home, and then he drops it with a kind of angry tenderness. Theft will not be allowed. That rule is as strict as any else tonight. If someone forgets it, the reminder will be swift and not unkind until kindness fails. Further along, a second group moves with its own tempo under the constraint of a hatch that sticks and a deck that pitches just enough to satisfy the harbour's desire to make even the simplest work a test. Somewhere, a man slips and catches himself with a barked laugh. Somewhere another curses and then apologizes to no one in particular. It is the audio of strain, the way a barn raising sounds an hour after it begins, serious and unadorned and honest as grain. The line at the rail proves itself efficient. The air begins to smell like leaves have been persuaded to surrender their pride all at once. Men who will be hoarse tomorrow do not yet count the cost to their voices. Their silence is their chosen voice tonight, and it must carry. A small commotion on the far side draws your eye. 2 figures have strayed from the agreed lanes of movement around the deck. One carries his hands too close to his coat. Another seems to have found a corner where he thinks no one will notice if he stows a handful of leaves for later. The correction is immediate and hard, and it has the sound of leather meeting wool rather than flesh meeting bone. The words delivered with it are the sort that, if you could peel the cold from them, might be called fatherly. Not another grain, not another pinch, not a shred will leave this deck except by the rail to the water. You see relief in that rebuke, a relief that the moral boundary you came to protect still stands even this deep in the night's intention. The men on shore who do not climb the gangways carry out a different duty. They tug floating clumps back into the water with poles, breaking apart rafts of leaves before the tide can find them a home against the pilings. They stamp on ice forming around the edges to clear the path for new drifts of tea. They watch for faces that mean trouble and for faces that mean news. From time to time, a whisper runs down the line. Another deck almost done. Another hatch found stubborn. The last chest on one ship being pried as if it were holding on to its secrecy by its iron bands. Alone, you think briefly about the consignees, snug in places where walls are thick and oaths are tighter than whispers. You do not hate them. You disagree with what they believe a town is for. You believe it is for preserving the capacity of neighbors to make, trade, and rest without being told the price of their cup by men who will never wash it. That thought animates you without burning you. If you let it burn, it would consume too much oxygen, and the night would become smoky with self-righteousness. What cannot be done in that smoke?
The men before you know this.
They keep their heads low, their motions steady, their minds on lids and rails, rails and water, water and the long, cold breath of a harbour that receives what it is given without comment. Somewhere behind you, farther up the street, a door opens and closes. Somewhere on a nearby vessel, a sailor coughs and pulls his blanket up to his chin. Somewhere on shore, a woman checks a window again and again for a figure she loves to pass under the one lamp that makes his shape unmistakable. The town learns that everything is connected, but that connection is not mystical, is practical. A man on a deck working quickly in gloves will mean a shop can open tomorrow with an air of decency about it. A chest tipped cleanly means a conversation can proceed without the sediment of scandal. A night like this, contained, precise, unglamorous, is how a community protects its face in the mirror. You feel the cold begin to bite the small bones of your hands, even though you have done nothing but stand and witness. Your legs ache. Your breath is a measured engine in your chest. You look up at the masts and see the faintest trembling of lines in a breeze that is not enough to trouble hats. You decide that the work has the look of being only half begun. You decide, too, that your part will be to carry the memory of this exactness to those who will ask later whether the town lost itself in the dark. You will be ready to answer that it did not. But you also carry a question that shifts its weight from one shoulder to the other as you watch. Once the last chest drops its last dry shiver into the harbour, and the decks are swept of every stray leaf, and men go home to hands that will smell faintly of tea for days, what exactly will have been removed from your life? The leaf, the tax, the habit, or the illusion that ordinary people can live without being entangled by choices made far away? You watch the first lids give way as if the wood had been holding its breath all month and can release it only now. The sound is a quiet complaint, a split that suggests 100 other splits in 100 other places where stubborn timber finally conceded to the steady insistence of a tool properly used. You see how men take their places without a word, and you recognize the choreography from other forms of honest labor. Each man fills a role as naturally as he would at harvest or at a barn raising, a prior to tease up the edging boards, a lifter to tip the square weight toward light, a breaker to drive the small axe along the seams of a chest's pride, a guider to catch the loosened parcels before they scatter across the deck. Nothing is thrown thoughtlessly. A parcel is eased over the rail the way a bucket is eased down a well. Even now, amidst a moment meant to be remembered, care is still the primary craft. On the first ship, the work proceeds with the steadiness of a well-kept clock. The men on deck move as a set of interlocking gears, each turning the next, none spinning faster than the rest. Now and then, one pauses to draw breath, gloved fingers opening and closing to keep blood warm, then resumes place without calling attention to himself. A captain's lantern glows near the companionway, its flame hooded to cut glare and make sight sharp beyond. You can almost hear the captain's thoughts in the way the lantern is set. How to keep order, how to preserve the ship, how to make it through a night that is neither mutiny nor routine, but something else entirely. He does not bark orders. He observes and trusts the assurances given earlier that spar and line and mast will be safe. It is a strange comfort to you that a sea captain and a shore town can share a concern so basic as the safety of a hull. As parcels of tea break into their smaller, tighter shapes, the scent rises like a ghost, familiar from countless kitchens and yet different at this scale. It is not a kettle's whisper of leaves, but the dry, persistent sweetness of stockpiled plant meeting air. The smell makes your mind jump to morning tables, to chipped cups and blue paper that once wrapped sugar cones, to a ladle set down on a hook while steam made spectacles fog and children go quiet in the face of warmth. The collision of that domestic odor with the cold black rush of the harbors is disorienting and clarifying at once. This is the life you know meeting the law you do not accept. And you are watching the meeting made visible in the simplest way a town can manage. Leaf released to water, without harm to ship or man. You note the weight of a chest by the way two men strain. Some are manageable by a single back. Others require two in a rhythm built on the count of 1, 2, 3 lift. The heavier boxes are cracked and lightened first, as if the workers mean to reserve their strength for later, when the cold will have stolen some muscle from hands and arms. A chest's corner goes first, then a side, then the whole gives way to the tools argument, and inside the lined interior, the tea waits like tightly folded cloth. The sound of parcels meeting water is more like rain than like thunder. Plop, plop, a constant metronome, interrupted only by the hiss of a larger
bale that breaks apart slowly as if reluctant to
surrender the integrity pressed into it far away by hands whose owners will never know this water or this cold. The second ship offers different problems,
as any second task does.
Boards do not fit quite as the first did. Hatches stick as if they resent being asked to imitate their neighbor's obedience. A coil of rope lies inconveniently where a line of men wants to pass. The adjustment is immediate and practical. The coil is moved. A plank is wedged. A man with a stronger wrist is fetched to a hinge that resists. You see the value of practice in a town where people grow up learning that stubborn things yield not to fury, but to roped patience. A joke flickers and dies at the wrong moment, snuffed by the pressure of time, then returns later to prove the men still own themselves. You think it a sign of health that humor can visit even when gravity rules along the rail. The rule against theft is enforced with a precision that would be admirable in any shop. A hand that lingers where it should not is rapped and corrected. A man who thinks to pocket a tight press of leaf is collared, forced to empty his coat, and warned with humanity steeped in iron. No one is named. No one is humiliated for sport. The aim is not to make an example. The aim is to keep the example from existing. You catch a brief, strange tenderness in the way a hand grips a shoulder, squeezes once, and lets go. The men are not enemies to one another. They are guardians of a line they insisted on in meetings and must honor now, or else swallow the bitter knowledge that their own hands betrayed their own vows. The water itself becomes a participant. Tea spreads across its surface like a stain you cannot scrub from a shirt, a map of effort printed in faint, irregular shapes. Men on the wharf use poles to churn the floating leaves back toward the middle, breaking apart clumps that might snag and return. You watch a small raft of tea catch for an instant on a ladder's lower rung before being kicked away with a quick, efficient boot. When a child's voice rises on shore with a laugh at the absurdity of a harbor that smells like kitchen, a nearby hand hushes it with kindness. The night is not angry, but it is serious, and seriousness does not like to be made into a show. The only near incident you see comes when an onlooker shouts a name not his own to urge a man toward rashness. It is a trick as old as any quarrel, Make a person feel seen in the wrong way and watch him perform for the mirror. The response is swift and surgical. A calm voice turns and cuts the string on which the attempted puppetry depends. Not tonight, not here, not for this, it says, not with words, but with the discipline of a gaze that refuses drama. The mischief wanders off like smoke, unable to find a draught to feed it. You feel grateful for small mercies like this, where what might have become a story becomes only a moment and then a memory that will fade. On the third ship, timing threatens to become witness. The hour grows late enough that creaking can carry. Light from lanterns seems more visible to anyone beyond the wharf, and the men's breath comes heavier. Yet the work remains governed by that same quiet intention you have admired all night. When a lock is broken that should not have been, a word passes as sure as a tide. Take note, replace it after. The promise is small and telling. In the morning, the ship will not appear pillaged. It will appear worked upon with a kind of scrupulousness that rescues the town's face from caricature. You imagine a replacement padlock set where the broken one hung, metal to metal, in a symbolic act of tidiness that will say to anyone who cares to see, "We did what we came to do, and no more." A sailor on one ship's crew steps forward with a face that suggests he has calculated risk since he first swabbed a deck. He is told he has nothing to fear if he keeps to the rules of tonight. He watches for a minute, then stands aside, neither ally nor enemy. His captain, too, has decided that prudence now will protect him in the accounting to come, and he prefers to owe his ship's safety to the town's vows rather than to his own bravado. You catch the philosophy in a captain's silence. A vessel must live for many voyages. A moment of ceremony does not get to take a timber with it for memory's sake. The counting begins as the end approaches. Men tally the chests by a system of fingers and murmured tens, then tens of tens, until they arrive at a number they already know will be written by others in other rooms tomorrow. What matters to them now is not the number, but that it was reached cleanly. A last bale is dug free from under a confusion of spare rigging and slid across the deck with a grunt that sounds like relief. The rail receives it without complaint. The harbour takes it without blessing. The night breathes once as if it had been waiting for this moment, then resets its lungs for the next ship's last chest. When the final lid is pried, and the final parcel breaks into a cascade that darkens the water like ink dissolving in a basin, you expect a sound from the men, a sigh or a muttered cheer.
None comes.
The first sound after the finish is the scratch and swish of brooms. Decks are swept. Stray leaves are gathered and tossed into the drink. Nails and splinters are kicked toward the scuppers, then brushed into the sea with the rest. A broken lock is found, turned over, examined, and replaced with a new one produced from a pocket, as if it had been waiting for this ceremony to prove that rules are not sculptures but tools. You use them, you put them back, and you make sure they still fit the door. You feel the tail end of the work as a throbbing in the town's pulse. Men disperse the way they arrived, singly, quietly, with the humility of people who have completed a chore rather than won a contest. Some leave by lanes nobody bothers to name, their steps practiced and their coats quick to swallow their shapes. A few pass you at a distance near the stacks of hogsheads and the coiled hemp, and you look at the ground out of courtesy. When the last lantern on deck is hooded and lowered, you realize that the night has become ordinary again. The harbour sound returns to its usual language: slap, creak, whisper, breathe. You wait a few more minutes because you dislike leaving any job in its first quiet. The cold has found its way through every seam of your clothing. Your hands ache as if you had done the lifting yourself. You place your palms on the head of a barrel to steady yourself before turning to go, and you feel the wood's stored day warmth still lingering. It seems a promise disguised as physics. Work done during daylight and work done carefully by night leaves a residue of order that lasts just long enough to guide you out of the dark. As you climb the small rise toward home, you carry with you an image you know will return whenever the kettle sighs at your hearth in months to come. A rail busy with careful hands, a deck swept of stray leaves, a harbour that smelled for one strange hour, like every kitchen at once. It is a comfort and a burden. Comfort because the town kept its head, burden because you suspect that this discipline will be asked of you again and again as the years unroll. So you ask yourself, measuring breath to the cold. Now that the chests are gone and the lines still hold, now that a promise to do no more than necessary has been kept in the teeth of urgency, what other promises will ordinary people be obliged to keep if the distant rooms that write your rules decide to tighten them further? You walk home through streets that seem relieved to have a job behind them. Windows are dark in most houses, and the few that are lit show nothing but the calm of a chair's shadow and a kettle's modest shape near the hearth. You enter your own kitchen softly as if not to wake the place itself. Habit takes over, bank the fire, warm the hands, set out a cup in case sleep proves cagey and you need the small comfort of hot water in the mouth. Your clothes hold the night like a memory. Tar, cold, and the faint penetrating smell of tea that will, you suspect, cling longer than you expect it to. You wash your hands and notice how the scent persists in the lines of your skin. It is not unwelcome. It is only odd to be marked by a plant's history so thoroughly. Sleep comes in short sections. Your mind, trying to be obedient to rest, insists on its own brand of inventory. You count the noises of the wharf in memory the way a baker counts loaves cooling on a rack. The creak of a ladder, the clack of a tool set down just so, the hush that followed when the deck was swept. The sounds come back not to agitate, but to assure you that they have been placed where they belong. Even so, each time you drift, you rise again with a thought that refuses to let the job end in your head. Tomorrow, the harbour will tell on the town. How it tells will matter more than anything anyone says. You prefer evidence to rumour. You decide before sleep finally holds that you will go look early. Morning breaks with a cold that feels cleaner than the nights. The harbour wears a new perfume. The air, usually briny with a background of fish, tar, and salt, carries the faint sweetness of tea's leaf, vegetal, papery, and at the edges, bitter. You walk toward the wharf with a practical curiosity that seems to animate everyone else you pass. Faces are calm, not avid.
No one wants to gawk.
They want to make sure the work remained what it declared itself to be. The wharves always attract early risers, fishermen, carters, night watchmen, coming off duty, but today the balance tilts toward housekeepers with errands and artisans with tools in their hands on the way to shops. What you see confirms what the town meant to accomplish. The ships float as ships do after any hard night, with the hint of fatigue that wood and rope always show when tasks have been run through to their end.
Rigging is intact.
Sails furled remain as they were.
No spar is marred.
Decks are clean in a way that declares attention rather than indifference. Here and there, a dull smear suggests that tea's dust refused to leave without argument, but even these patches are reduced to suggestion by diligent sweeping. A padlock glints where one had broken, the replacement sitting as if it had always hung there, metal, quiet against metal. Such small proof satisfies you more than a speech could. It is the difference between being told virtue was kept and seeing the latch that made it so. The harbour itself looks like a painting that a careless artist smudged with a brown brush. Tea floats in islands and ribbons. Men with poles continue the work of last night, pushing clumps away from pilings where they might catch and rot, breaking apart rafts that could invite mischief by making salvage too easy. Children, sharp-eyed by nature, point at the floating leaves and then at the men with poles wanting to do the same, but are held back by mothers who understand that the line between curiosity and mischief is easier to cross than to recross. A carter passing along the roadway above pauses and sniffs, then nods to himself, as if he has understood something that language is too blunt to hold. A small knot of men stands near a place where the tide brings in more leaf than elsewhere. One bends to lift a handful, squeezes, and lets it fall. The tea, water-swollen now, has lost its neatness, and the leaf falls apart as readily as the town's patience did when politeness met refusal for the last time. Someone jokes that the harbour has brewed a giant kettle for breakfast, and that all the town is invited. The joke sits a moment, then fades, too obvious to keep. A watchman, whose legs still carry last night's hours, says quietly that the men will keep on until the tide turns and the worst of the flotsam has drifted out. People nod without being asked. It is exactly the sort of dull, necessary task that keeps misinterpretation from becoming tomorrow's almanac entry. You hear an assortment of second-hand stories pass like small coins. A man who tried to pocket ground leaf and got his ear boxed for it. A boy who was sent to fetch a hammer and returned with two, just in case. A sailor who stood at a hatch with his arms folded and his jaw slack and said not a word from first lift to last sweep. A ship's mate who offered a lantern when another flickered low and then looked at the flame as if it were a friend and said a silent good night when it was hooded. You accept these pieces the way you accept any town's version of the truth, in fragments, many of them true, none of them entirely complete alone. None of the stories you overhear suggest gloating. None suggests rage. They suggest work and the relief after work. You walk the edge of the boards and feel the cold searching for a way through boot leather. You find yourself thinking not of politics, but of a broken chair at home that could be set to rights with a half hour and a new peg. Your mind does this when larger matters threaten to capture all its attention. It refuses to hand over the keys to the house. It insists on errands, on lists, on bread, on the dollop of molasses you promised a child if she would go early to bed. You are grateful for this insistence. Towns that forget how to sweep floors while arguing about constitutions make themselves sick. In the warehouses and counting rooms, the day's work gathers itself into a different pattern. Merchants calculate quietly, understanding that tea has become something they will handle differently for a time. They chart losses to be sure, but they also chart the gains that come from clarity. It is easier to plan for next month, when you know which channels are blocked and which flow. Shopkeepers open their doors and are met by customers who want the ordinary things they always want. Candles, salt, needles, a length of ribbon, a paper of pins, a half-pound of something to make the afternoon civilized, and who will endure substitutes for certain luxuries because no one wants to argue every time they reach for a cup. The women who keep households smooth the change with skill. They know that morale is its own kind of supply and that a kitchen can be made hospitable with herbs, coffee's bitterness, or cocoa's weight if sugar can be spared. News goes out from the wharf with the steadiness of a baker delivering loaves. Across town, people lift their heads and find that a decision has been made visible, but not made monstrous. Other towns will hear of it and measure themselves against it, the way neighbors compare gardens. Some will be encouraged, some will be afraid, some will calculate. Your concern for now is not with distant places. It is with the afternoon's tasks and with a question that has been pacing your house's hallway like a neighbor waiting politely to ask a favor. What will be done to answer a night like this? And will the answer respect the care taken? Or will it come like a shutter slamming in a wind that has not been measured? At midday, with the harbour still smelling faintly like a cupboard and the ships rocking with their ordinary patience, you sit and write a few lines in your own humble book. Bread baked, tea absent, harbour cleared as much as possible, evening to be watched. You do not often write your feelings. You record acts. Acts you have learned age better on the page than judgments do. Still, you allow yourself one sentence that is not about bread or kindling or candles. You write that the town did what it said it would do and that it did it with the sort of care that makes future care possible. You suppose someone far away may read only a number how many chests, and miss the manner. The manner, you think, is the meaning. That evening, as lamplight makes islands in streets pressed thin by cold, you step outside and listen for the sound of a life returning to itself. It is there. A saw in a shop, a laugh let out at last, a latch lifted and set down again, with the softness that says a child is asleep inside. You consider brewing something plain and hot, not because you wish to replace anything, but because the hands want occupation, while the mind moves through its own neat habits of checking windows and counting tasks done. You know the shape of winter's weeks to come. You can picture the emptiness that will
follow on the other side of this night when a government that could
not bring itself to grant a ship permission to leave decides to show what permission.
Looks like when flipped into punishment, you
look out across a town returned, for the moment, to its own hands, and you ask the last question this night offers you, in the quiet after a careful refusal, when neighbors have proven they can be gentle with force and precise with anger. Will those far rooms answer with similar precision, or will they mistake restraint for weakness and force a season in which ordinary life must become a longer, duller resistance than anyone in this harbor would have chosen? You measure the port's closure not by proclamations pinned to doors, but by the way sounds change. Wharves that once sang with the musical thump of barrels rolling and the call and answer of men settling loads now sound like attics, hollow, dusty, a little haunted by memory. The first mornings after the law takes effect, you can hear gulls more clearly because there is less competition for the air. The birds seem surprised by their own dominance. A cart arrives out of habit and leaves out of prudence. A rope walk's door opens, then closes, the foreman having counted orders and found them fewer. The harbour itself, constrained by law,
offers its own commentary in a voice that is the same as always. Slap, slap,
slap against pilings, as if to taunt human arrangements with the constancy of water. You notice the change most sharply in the faces of men who have always worked at the edge of the tide. Carters who earned by the load look at their hands the way you look at a shelf that should hold flour and holds only a jar or two. Sailors who have no ship to scrub mend their clothes more carefully and hang them in orderly ranks as if neatness might stand in for employment. Wharfingers take to walking their planks as if the boards were an orchard that might bear fruit again if paced in the right pattern. Coopers, who make and mend the very bellies of commerce, know their skill is not obsolete, only paused. Still, a pause that arrives by decree, not by season, feels like a theft of rhythm. You begin to plan your days according to this new, slower clock. In kitchens, people adjust as they always have when the world refuses its usual kindness. Inventiveness becomes the most common ingredient. Coffee stretches by a finger's width of water. Cocoa is saved for plain days that need a friend. Herbs shoulder more of the work of hospitality. Sugar is nipped in smaller lumps. Flour is bargained for with more care. In some houses, rice arrives as a gift from people you have never met, an expression of kinship that travels farther than most townspeople ever will. You take turns making soup for those hit hardest, dock workers and sailors, widows who have no wages to back their courage. The week acquires a new axis, not market day, but charity day, when quiet baskets exchange hands without the clang of pride. Merchants who once counted their worth by the width of their shelves and the swiftness of their turnover adopt a new calculus. Prudence above pride, patience above show. Ledgers fill with lines that begin with the word deferred. The word is both lifeline and weight. You find a kind of loveliness in the way small shops become places of counsel as much as counters of goods, owners reminding neighbors which substitutes have worked in other houses, which tricks make candles burn truer, which launders can get the most out of a bar of soap. The advice is as valuable as any item on the shelf. You realize that in a town stripped of maritime bustle, conversation becomes a currency that keeps spirits liquid. The government's answer to tea, the closure that is meant to be lesson, warning and punishment, arrives not just as an order, but as a geography change. A town that faces water and welcomes it is told to treat that face as a wall. Some business shifts up the coast to harbours not yet throttled, and you hear the grind of resentment in the mouths of people made to travel farther for what used to come to their feet. The seats of power move too, as officials take rooms in places that do not smell like tar and rope, believing perhaps that distance will make obedience easier. You see in this the usual misunderstanding of administrators who think that moving a desk changes the facts beneath it.
A town goes on being itself.
It just becomes itself under strain. Troops, red-coated and regular, men of drill and drum, are more present than before. They are not new to you, but their posture alters when a port is closed. They become furniture in the streets, constantly there, reminding everyone that the law travels in company. You watch them the way you would watch a stove that draws too much, carefully, respectfully, with a habit of keeping cloths away from its edges. You do not treat every soldier as an enemy. You know that he too is someone's son, that he too writes a letter home and worries about boots and food and boredom. You also know that uniforms can be mistaken for arguments, and you prefer to run your errands early when tempers are cooler all around. Meetings continue, but their spirit is altered by necessity. Before the port closed, you gathered to prevent a duty from becoming a habit. Now you gather to keep habit alive in the face of duties laid on from afar. Committees that once wrote letters of argument now write lists of needs. Bread, fuel, fabric, fish, medicine. Each item is given the dignity of a sentence, and each sentence is given the dignity of action. You are impressed by how quickly a room full of people can turn from oratory to logistics, how men who can speak for an hour can also spend the same hour scraping wax strips from a meeting house floor to save the candles a little longer. Neighbours rediscover old skills. Spinning wheels hum more steadily in a dozen parlours. Flax is combed with care. Wool is carded and spun into thread that, while not as fine as imported cloth, binds pride to warmth. The sound of a loom becomes the sound of a stance. You begin to recognize in the weaving of cloth a pattern of thought that other places will admire and perhaps imitate. The women who sustain these arts accept the applause of rhetoric with polite smiles and return to the labor that makes rhetoric possible. You learn to measure respect for a neighbor not by the ferocity of his opinions, but by the steadiness of his hands at ordinary work. Prices? Always the truest rumor mill. Whisper, week by week, where the town is sore. Salt goes dear, and with it the ability to preserve meat. Coal fluctuates like a mood. Wood is more reliable, but it demands time, and time spent chopping is time not spent in other tasks. A few clever households pool labor. One person cuts while another cooks for both. A third mends harness in exchange for a share of wood. Barter, the oldest of currencies, becomes a theology again. It requires faith, keeps accounts human, and leaves behind fewer grudges than coins sometimes do. You trace the pattern and see a town insisting that it still owns itself, even if its harbour has been lent, against its will, to the purposes of a parliament that writes rules like nets. From farther away come signs that your town is not as alone as those who issued the punishment meant it to be. Wagons arrive from inland with flour and sympathy. Ships from other colonies carry goods to neighbouring ports, and their cargoes find their way by cart and courage into kitchens like yours. Letters arrive that read like blankets on a cold night, softening the edges of exhaustion. You do not know most of the names that sign them. You do not need to. You can hear the timbre of kinship even through ink. You add a line in your ledger labelled gifts, and beside it, a small prayer to be a good steward of them so that honour is paid both ways. What you miss most about an open harbour is not only the goods, it is the calendar. A port keeps time for a town the way a bell keeps time for a church. Arrivals mark weeks, departures mark hopes. Storms that delay ships give you stories. Calm water gives you ease. Without the tide's business to translate into commerce, the days threaten to become a long, undifferentiated cloth. You combat this by making more of small festivals than you did before, by inventing new reasons to gather, by counting victories the way you count stitches in a shawl. Completion, however humble, becomes a medicine. You make a point of visiting friends who are not friends of convenience because community, under sanction, must become deliberate. News from the rooms where laws are made continues to arrive with the coldness of paper not yet warmed by a hand. Additional measures are spoken of, arrangements shifted, punishments hinted at for those who do not conform to a shape drawn far away. You listen and then return to your errands, not because you are dismissive, but because you know that the address of your life is still your street, your square of hearth, your row of hooks where kettles and clothes hang. You keep asking the question that has replaced the last one. If a government can close a town's lungs for a season, how will a people make a new way to breathe that keeps hearts steady without teaching them to love the closure more than the openness they hope to restore? You learn to speak new names alongside familiar ones, and the map of your world expands even as travel becomes harder. Other colonies that were once stories told by sailors become correspondents who write as if they live in the next street. A committee here writes to a committee there, and the letters carry more than arguments. They carry inventories, promises, and a tone of mutual respect, strengthened with each exchange. What was once a collection of places begins to feel like a neighborhood, irritable at times, proud always, and now rehearsing the possibility of acting like a single household in matters that require it. Within town, committees proliferate in response to real needs rather than fashion. One watches prices to warn of unfair practice cloaked in necessity. Another distributes donations with a fairness taught by women who have been balancing households for years on sums that would insult a merchant's ink. A third keeps watch on the temptation to overreact, reminding neighbors that patience is not surrender, but a method. You might have once mocked such meetings for their dullness. Now you thank the dull for preventing the exciting from becoming ruinous. The very boredom that was a complaint last year has become a balm. Cloth takes on the weight of an argument without ever raising its voice. Spinning wheels move at 100 hearths, and the thread that accumulates becomes a small declaration on each lap. You attend a gathering where women set their wheels in a circle and make their work public for a morning, not as demonstration so much as encouragement. There is no speech. There is only a steady whisper of fiber becoming yarn and the occasional correction offered with neighborly authority. Hold your twist looser here, a touch tighter there. Children bring water and retrieve dropped spindles.
And you realize that this is
What a town looks like when it chooses to make its argument through texture rather than through noise. You sense a corresponding quiet sharpening among men who drill in open fields on days when weather allows. They do not call it anything grand in conversation, but the look that passes between them when a line holds straight under command is a new kind of courtesy, an acknowledgement that the body must learn what the mind already believes. They carry their firelocks the way a cooper carries his adze, as tools to be respected and to be put away, polished. You do not thrill at the sight of armed neighbors. You would rather see axes and hammers do all the work a town requires. But you accept that a household cannot ask to be safe without keeping a few implements recognizable by those who would test that safety. The year turns toward a late summer and autumn that carry their own alarms.
a rumor runs that powder has been seized or threatened, and men move with a quickness that startles you only because it is so well ordered.
For a breathless day the roads beat with feet and hooves, and then, as if the town has remembered itself mid-step, the pace slackens into sense. Exaggeration is corrected, breath is caught, and the lesson is logged in the ledger where all such lessons belong. Signals can run ahead of facts. Discipline must run ahead of signals. You commit this to memory not as politics but as a rule for surviving any winter. The markets continue, altered but not abandoned. Apples, cabbages, onions, turnips, the honest citizens of the cold months, line stalls with a bravery that makes you admire the earth more than ever. Salted fish holds a place of honor. Bread rises on tables where yeast is coaxed by hands that have learned to read temperature by cheek and wrist.
A butcher teaches a boy to sharpen a knife until it sings against the steel. None of this is spectacular.
All of it is a refusal to let the spectacular steal the useful. You buy what you can, exchange what you must, and leave a coin or a favor's promise according to what the day requires. Your own house adopts its share of adjustments. You mend with thread whose color does not match, and decide you prefer the reminder of thrift to the illusion of newness. You keep a list of skills to learn: how to leaven with less, how to make candles from scraps with fewer drips, how to dry sage so that it keeps its character when January asks for it. You teach a child to make a knot that lies flat and a stitch that will not pull under stress. You hang your wash with an eye on the sky that has become more practiced than your eye was before. Each small improvement is a kind of vote cast in the ballot box of endurance, in rooms where ordinances are read, and where the same couple dozen chairs hold the same dozen. Familiar marks from the same dozen familiar elbows. The language of the day alters around the edges. Words like reconciliation are used carefully, as if made of glass. Words like rights are set down on the table as if they were loaves to be sliced, shared, and eaten. The men who speak them, some famous now, some never to be, learn that eloquence is sweetest when it feeds action and sours quickly when it is asked to replace it. You listen and think how useful it is to have watched a night at a wharf where eloquence was a broom and a lock rather than a flourish. A few people leave town for opportunities elsewhere, and their absence writes itself in the lengthened gap between familiar faces on your daily path. You understand their choice without endorsing it for yourself. Others arrive, relatives from inland who bring their hands and their goodwill. The population changes its seasoning a little. The main dish remains the same, stubborn, decent, proud of its tools. Your own circle tightens and deepens, dependent less on convenience than on trust. This too is a resource. You label it in your ledger under the line you have created for intangible stores: patience, humor, songs, stories, skills, friends. Letters from across the water arrive with a pace that suggests the other side believes time to be its ally. Proposals, condemnations, instructions, rehearsals of law and custom, paper stacks upon paper. You find your eyes sliding from these to the single sheet pinned near your hearth with your own household rules. Save fat. Mend early, not late. Share heat. Do not let resentment sit down at the table.
Offer a cup, even if the cup is humble.
You are not an enemy of law. You are a friend of laws that fit the life they are asked to shape. Your skepticism grows toward any rule written by someone who does not know what it takes to make a candle burn in a draught. As the winter presses again, you feel the shape of an answer forming that is not in anyone's speech. It is in the sound of a wheel, the steady report of a hammer, the disciplined line of men who practice not because they like the look of themselves, but because they have accepted the possibility of a task they will not choose. You begin to ask yourself a fresh question with an old echo. If patience has been your strongest instrument, and principle has been your rhythm, what melody will you choose if asked, at last? To play louder, will you remember to carry the quiet with you into the noise, so that when the noise ends, you can still hear yourself think? You wake one spring morning to a feeling that the town has drawn a breath it will not exhale as easily as before. The months of closed harbour and careful adjustments have thickened everyone's sense of consequence. You go through your routine with an exactness that borders on reverence, not because a ceremony has been proclaimed, but because you sense that life is about to refuse its usual mercy of repeating itself. The kettle sings at the same register. The bread rises just as it did last week. Your hand knows the weight of the broom and the sweep of the stairs. Yet under everything runs another music, a low string humming a note you feel in your ribs. News arrives not in a shout, but in a sequence. Movements inland, supplies sought and sequestered, lines drawn and tested. You do not run to watch. You remember the lesson of autumn's alarm, and you dislike how easily a town can trip over its own energy. You keep to your work until keeping to your work would be irresponsibility. And you join your neighbours where the roads meet and carry more than cartwheels. The faces you see are the ones you have seen in every season. Familiar, humour tucked away for later, mouths set in lines borrowed from fathers and uncles whose names you know from old stories told by a hearth. Something happens out there beyond your line of sight that you feel in your bones before words assemble properly to describe it. The day lengthens into a history lesson that chooses its students without asking. The quiet men become the busiest. The loudest men become sometimes the quietest. A neighbour you have always trusted to fix a hinge becomes the man who helps carry someone from the roadside. Another who can measure cloth by the glance of an eye becomes the one who can measure distances between danger and safety and lead a small cluster of the frightened from one to the other. You do not rename these people in your head. You keep their household identities alongside their sudden public ones. It helps you remember that towns are not made of titles. You return home from the edge of these events with the smell of powder wrapped around your coat and the taste of grit on your teeth that no water will remove immediately. You wash. You make a thin stew because you will not eat something that tastes richly of its own while your mind is full of what you have seen and half seen. You set aside a corner of your kitchen table to hold the small objects that have become talismans of the hour, a strip of cloth torn for bandage and now washed and folded, a splinter of wood from a fence post that no longer stands where you always assumed it would, a button found in the lane whose owner you may not see again. You do not need these to remember. You need them to keep your mind from floating away into fear. After such a day, the town meets itself in the mirror with a new frankness. The questions you have been asking in quieter months now stand in the street with you. What is a town for if not to hold itself together when the wind takes its roof? What is a neighbour for if not to make sure your fire does not gutter out when you need it at its steadiest? What is a law for if not to convince a human heart to choose the decent path even when nobody is watching? In your head, these are not questions with abstract weight. They are dull, heavy objects you lift and put down each morning. You feel a line being crossed that you would have preferred to approach, test, and retreat from. You would have liked a long season of letters, substitutions, patient refusals, and carefully measured nights on a wharf to be enough to instruct distant rooms. But you live in the world you have, not the one you organized in logic. A boy who carried notes at meetings now carries messages of a different sort between houses. A woman whose spinning gave cloth to baby and guest alike now tears up a shirt she meant to keep for winter to bind a wound. A man who replaced a lock to keep faith with a ship now locks his door against a grief he is not ready to host. Each act is at once small and huge, at once boring and monumental. You take inventory of your house with a new eye, not the greedy eye that wants to hoard, not the fearful eye that sees lack everywhere, but the loving eye that notes where strength lies. You count jars, yes, but you also count songs you know by heart, stories you can tell without wandering, jokes you can deploy to soften a sharp hour, scriptures or sayings you trust when sleep is thin. You write a short list on a scrap, names of neighbours whose burdens you can lighten with a loaf or a length of cloth, names of neighbours whose laughter is a resource to borrow when your own runs low, names of neighbours whose shoulders need your hand and whose hands will steady your shoulder in return. You pin the list above the hearth and feel fortified by the simple act of alphabetizing comfort. Some will write about these months and these days as if they were a string of inevitabilities. You will not. You will remember them as a sequence of choices made by people whose hands smelled of soap and wool, tar and fish, bread and smoke. You will remember that the great words everyone uses, liberty, rights, duty, sat down at your table and were turned into loaves and stitches quiet lentils simmered while someone watched the street. You will remember that a night's work carefully done at a wharf was not an ending but a rehearsal for more careful work you did not ask to perform and would never have chosen as your main song at the close of a long day that will be written as the start of something larger than your kitchen. You lay your hand on the same table where you first counted the price of tea, and you feel the grain as if the oak can speak. It says what it has always said: be useful, be steady, be ready to hold weight. You decide to make a habit of laying your palm there whenever news arrives, to rejoin your skin to the wood, so that you do not forget what part of you is furniture, what part is flame. You will go on as you have, washing, mending, saving, sharing. But now the circle of your care includes a line of road stretching outward where neighbors you barely knew yesterday now walk. You end the day with an old question that has, by now, learned to live with you. If a people build their resistance out of boring virtues, tidy ledgers, swept decks, replaced locks, shared loaves, steady drills, can they carry those same virtues through the louder seasons without letting noise steal their shape? And will they emerge on the other side with the quiet still audible in their bones?